Und ja, willkommen hier im Metropol. Schön, dass ihr da seid. Und wir fangen auch direkt an, weil ich habe schon gesagt, wir haben gar nicht so
Let's
viel
get
Zeit.
started. It's good to have you all here. We have 50 minutes for digital sovereignty after the change in time, and I'll start with Bernd Schlömer. Since September 2021, he has been undersecretary in the digital ministry in the state of Saxony-Anhalt for the Liberal Party, FDP, and he used to be in the state parliament of Berlin before that. And digital sovereignty at state level, to what extent is that a topic, and has that changed in the context of the Ukrainian war? Or are you discussing this, or was the digital attack to Bitterfeld-Anhalt a bigger issue?
Well, for the district Anhalt-Bitterfeld, I can say that this was a driver to generally look into the topic and ask oneself what is happening under digitization and what are the options I've got within the information technology. And on a state level, well, this is very important. That is the topic of digital sovereignty is discussed. We want to have more self-determination. We want to be a shaper. We want to determine and drive the development of innovations. And this is not different from the federal state. We are doing this on a smaller scale. And in Saxony-Anhalt, this is a topic which is important to politicians.
Well, on my right-hand side, Annika Krellmann, you are responsible for information management at the communal organization for administration management. The same question to you. Has this become more of an issue due to the Ukrainian war? Are you cooking even smaller cookies?
Digitization is obviously also important for municipalities. Anhalt-Bitterfeld, the district, it's not the only district or municipality which really suffered such a cyber attack. And due to the Ukrainian war, we can see that within the community levels, especially with regard to critical infrastructure, where we've got a lot of communities, and thus IT security has become more important. Digital sovereignty existed beforehand, I would say. And what is so special about municipalities in comparison to the land or the federation, we have very, very different applications, 200 to 400. So municipal IT is very complex, and that doesn't make it easier with regard to open source. So with regard to IT infrastructure, I would say many municipalities are quite well established, but with regard to the username area, this is not the case. And at the same time, municipalities see that they're dependent on large IT service providers, but also from small niche providers, and we also have these. So this is definitely a topic.
Well, thank you very much. Then I'll move on to the left, where we have Andreas Reckert-Lodde. You are head of ZenDiS, the Center for Digital Sovereignty, attached to the Federal Ministry of the Interior.
Almost. It's the project group ZenDiS, but we are still in the foundation phase.
All right, but tell us what you're doing there, what you're planning to do, and maybe give us an idea of whether this topic will actually be a priority for the new government.
Okay, I can say something about this. First, on the ZenDiS, so Center for Digital Sovereignty, it should provide for more open source in administration, and this across the whole areas, that is the federation, but also the land. So as administration, we should join this jointly, and we want, in a first stage, be a federal institution in a first stage, and then together with the lender who would like, we would like to expand the limited company, and then across ZenDiS, we will make sure, just as for open source, we would like to offer services and consultancy to make open source more available, to customize it, and thus to help against the fights.
So you actually depend on the states being willing to contribute?
No. I would say at the end of the day, it's important to do this jointly. And that the will to do it jointly is the most important part. And to the whole question whether open source introduction, and I need to scales and the knowledge, and I need to prepare for this. But if I don't want this, and if I don't see a need for this, and if I don't want to get there, then it doesn't really help. It doesn't make sense to really put it on others who don't want. There's so many facets where administration has to adapt. Then you need the spirit within the different administrations and on community levels. There are individual ones which really made major advances and others trailing behind. And the same is true on a federal level and also on the state level. If you take Schleswig-Holstein, they are very far ahead and do a lot, and others are trailing behind.
Peter Ganten, I don't need to introduce you anymore. But this morning I'd mentioned that with the Open Source Business Alliance, you're accompanying the political events, and some of our listeners may not have been with us at the time, may have joined us only later. So I had asked you about your estimate concerning the commitment of the new government to digital sovereignty. You weren't too keen on, too enthusiastic about it.
Well, as I said this morning, when we looked at the agreement, the coalition agreement of the new government, we really were very happy with it. And I had been participating in one or the other backroom discussions, and I really had the feeling that this is going into the right direction. And we have to say that the former government had already initiated a few things. So the ZenDiS project is, or has been, had been founded during that time. That wasn't enough. And it was clear that with the end of this old government period, there was no major initiative. And this is why we thought that now there's really optimism for a double down that one would really pursue regarding this topic. Okay, and then we celebrated this for 4 weeks, and then we continued celebrating for another 4 weeks. And then we got a bit tired of celebrating, and then there was the first budget plan. Okay, and then really our jaws dropped, because we said the statements that were made and what we see in the budget, they don't click. So nothing of what they said appeared in it. Okay, and maybe you can find small details and you can't say there isn't anything at all, but it's really very, very far away from what is necessary, what would be required to really make a step forward. And I would like to reiterate, indeed, the situation of today is less and worse than what the old government did.
But in the context of the change, the sea change that we're seeing, it would be important to do this. But I'll get back to that. Let me start at the very bottom. Digital sovereignty has become a buzzword. Everybody uses it. Everybody says whether we want it. But we talk way too little about what we mean by it. At a Franco-German conference last week at the Technical University of Munich, where students performed various projects, they asked businesses what they understand by digital sovereignty, and not surprisingly, the result was that civil society, industry and administration have very different concepts of this. So I brought along a definition of the TFD Planning Council. Digital sovereignty is the ability and options of individuals and organizations to independently and in self-determination determine their role in IT. I would like to ask you, does that make sense to you, or does it leave out certain aspects from your specific perspective? Would you say that something else needs to be taken into consideration? Peter, you mentioned the global perspective. Is that enough? Is it a minimal definition, or do we need to include other aspects?
Well, we were co-authors or contributed to this paper, and it was a consensus that we developed jointly on a publication of OFE at the time. And the relevant question is what you do with it and what are the concrete targets, what do we want to achieve? Because I think definition is a question of interpretation, a question of the interpretation, but the question is, what is the strategy that we derive? What are the goals? We want to have influence on IT providers. So we need concrete points that substantiate this, and especially with regard to the administration, what do we want to do?
Maybe to add to this, the three aspects, possibility of changing independence of suppliers. It has to do with control. I think that's important. As in other industries, in IT, we're not ever completely independent, and open source, from our point of view, is one element here. I think there are areas where in public administration there is a certain level of sovereignty here, because there are different solutions, multi-supplier strategy, you can change, etc., etc. But there are areas where things are quite different. So we have to see, that's important to add this, particularly in the municipal context, where we really deal with with citizens' direct living space. Here, digital sovereignty includes the question of competencies. If you ever only learn proprietary products, then from childhood on, then you'll find it very difficult to deal with anything else throughout your life. So it has to do with democracy as well. And so it's important to discuss this topic, to limit the boundaries and to talk about, to define exactly what you're talking about.
Well, I would say the definition is not wrong, but it's not really something that can drive our actions. And that's a problem. I would wish for a definition which would clearly tell us what we have to pay attention to. So a definition which would allow us to more clearly derive a solution which is paying into digital sovereignty or not. And I don't want to repeat it again because I've said it so often. But the two things, to be able to control, and secondly, do we know what is happening with our data? Can we really make sure that nobody else has access to this? That's number one. And secondly, who can access under which conditions? And then also the capability to shape. So in a crisis situation, am I still capable of adapting this situation to new requirements, or am I not capable of doing this? For example, once a provider fails. Oh, sorry, and I somehow have a problem. So if I'm no longer friends, for example, with a provider. Okay, sorry, I just need to adjust. Can you still hear me? Okay, wonderful. And the point that Annika mentioned is totally right. The selection also allows to have more control and possibility to shape. But sometimes in procedures, specialist procedures, ask myself, is that a good idea? Is it good to have 20 providers of the same system with similar features? Wouldn't it be better to just have one or two open source solutions and you just pay the same amount of money for that? But at the end of the day, that would allow us to have more scope for action and design.
Well, would you like to add something? Well, in principle, the definition is insufficient. If I speak on behalf of public administration now, or as somebody who has to take decisions, the criterion of self-determination, independency, and choice are the aspects that are governed by digital sovereignty. And what I also find important, and that applies to all levels of government, is the ability to evaluate new technologies, which we didn't have in the past. Oftentimes, we're offered products that we can't evaluate ourselves, and digital sovereignty would include that. capability, and we're actually doing very poorly in the public administration, and it's getting ever worse. We can maybe improve this, and that's a very political approach now, but it's an important aspect to foster research, development, and innovation in order to create service products that increase the bandwidth available. That is very important. Let me give you an example. I'm in the city of Magdeburg. Intel is building a factory there now. Everybody's happy about it, but the opportunity is also there to ask, what does it mean if we have chip production in my state of Saxony-Anhalt? And what can we do in order to offer more choice? Because this company will, of course, attract a lot of people who have knowledge in terms of semiconductor technologies. So we have more opportunities for microelectronics to foster open source technologies, which will, with public subsidies as well, which will contribute to digital sovereignty. The topic of education is part and parcel of it. That's very important to me, so that an individual decision is possible. And in so far, this general definition can mean a lot. You can derive a lot of it, but you have to operationalize it. I got my staff on board for us to develop a fundamental program IT to define an operative target for the state of Saxony-Anhalt, so that it becomes clear that this is something that needs to be taken into consideration in the context of administration at all levels in the state of Saxony-Anhalt. We need to make ourselves more independent of these monopolistic structures that require us to get licenses again and again. And in this whole bouquet, we can overcome this. We're a representative of Dataport. We are the sponsor of Dataport as well, so I won't speak too much about it. So we should try to harness development and innovation in order to generate your own choices, to be capable of innovation. I think that's very important for digital sovereignty, and decision makers among politicians need to foster this politically, otherwise it won't work.
Well, there's one point which is really very important to me, and this is a point which often is not said clearly enough. It's something that I would like to underline. So, of course, open source is a must for digital sovereignty. However, if we don't have competencies and people who can really assess this, who can shape this and use it, then even an open source code will not help us. And this is why it is so important to do this. We really need a digitally educated society. This is true with regard to general knowledge, but also expert knowledge, and especially the administration suffer even more than companies of this.
Can I zoom out of this? Because the next question that I have ties into this, would be more of a big picture. We heard a lot about global dependencies this morning, and this is what digital sovereignty is all about. Well, not only, but among other things. And we are also speaking a lot more about dependencies from authoritarian regimes, China specifically. And China invests a lot of resources and money into open source software. Do we need to be afraid there? Is the solution to create more resources in administration so that people can contribute to developing, to develop a counterpoint to the Chinese strategy?
Well, this is the reason why we would like to develop ZenDiS and develop a counterbalance. Whether this works with regard to figures remains to be seen because they have a much higher power behind this. But we want to use it. Okay, we need competence in our own country. We need to provide the resources so that we co-shape, and we need competencies. These have to be developed and promoted, but we also make sure that we've got the required ecosystem, because we as a state cannot do everything by ourselves. We couldn't do it, and this is not something that we would like to do. But at least we would have to be able to become a stronger client, and for that we need competences. So don't try to shy away and say we can't compete with the Chinese and let's forget about it, but let's do something and then we can assess what they're doing. And you can't say that everything they're doing is really bad. Well, this is something that one shouldn't do, because maybe they do something which is good. Just to give you an example, once beta data are exchanged in China, terabytes, maybe then I need a different level of security than at the Federal Criminal Office here in Germany. So the question is, can I assess for what it is needed? And the point is totally correct. We are at the point where we need to develop competencies, because if we don't do it now, then in the medium term we will run into problems, because then digitization will take place. And if we don't really develop ourselves and really prepare, then those who have digitized over the last 10 years will just overcome us.
Are there any measures at state and municipal level to build competencies and enable people to take decisions?
Well, I'm also in charge of the IT stuff. I didn't know until recently. And then I'm asked, oh, why don't you do something about development of IT stuff and so on? And this is not something that you can just pull out of a pocket. But we are currently asking ourselves, well, how, if you look at the university level, how grants, for example, could allow us to access other groups which are outside of the EU. At the University of Magdeburg, for example, we have many students coming from India and Pakistan, and they study informatics, software development, engineering, electrotechnics, and so on. And then they disappear after the studies immediately. They go back to their countries. And currently, we are wondering how strategies could be developed, also in cooperation, by the way, with the economy, with entrepreneurs within our state. So developing strategies to bind these. And scientists always tell me, oh, we've already done anything we can. But I think the science sector is also asked to look for new options, how education and software development competence, for example, can be targeted in such a way that you reach people who have so far not been reached, and that they then can get the competences to really be made capable. And we discussed it. Open source community is always the question, who's the Linux king, who can solve the most complicated problems, and that one will be the king or the queen. But we have to see men, women have to be given low threshold levels, easy entry levels, so that software development doesn't mean I need a thesis in intelligence services or other studies. So we need more easy access, and this is science that has been done. And the development that software development had done over the last 30 years, and this development will be very different from the development that we'll see within the next 30 years. So we have to create access and own competencies, autarky, and self-responsibility have to be generated. And for me, so I'm in charge of the public administration, this is something that we have to look at. So we're trying to develop these tender plans, and this cultural level is a task of the land and not the federation.
Maybe I can add to that, because I think it's important, because oftentimes we simplify things. We always think of IT experts, that we have a shortage of experts there that we need to cooperate with the municipalities, with science, with the companies, etc. But if we zoom into practical applications, if I wonder why does municipal administration fail with open source, then it's due to the fact that we lack expertise in or know-how in many different areas, maybe IT, but also in procurement, for instance. In IT revision, I know that auditors at the municipal level don't deal with that at all, that they don't realize that there are services, for instance, that I can purchase to support me, so that there are oftentimes stereotypes. It's about IT security, about awareness, generally speak, of staff, also to be open to product changes because we're socialized to using certain products that we're familiar with. And I know that's only a drop in the ocean, but nevertheless, it's important to offer initial qualification measures for this in order to for people to learn about the entire scope around themselves so they can dare take the next step.
Peter, I already told you this morning about yesterday evening where we had I had great talks, and what was really impressive to me was the commitment, companies' commitment to support administration, saying, I want that they use open source, and I really make everything and anything to make sure that they are doing okay, that they get a backing within the administration. So these companies of the open source industry, what do they need to do in order to make sure that politicians understand why they should opt for open source?
Let me see if I understood the question well.
Well, how can companies help to develop competence?
Well, these are two very separate levels. The one level is the operative one of administration, as Annika just said, where there are shortages left, right, and center, and where we as companies are called upon to give our support, and we do sometimes. In the Open Source Business Alliance, some years ago, we came up with a guideline to explain administrations of how to use, how to source open source software, and every municipality doesn't have to decide that individually. I think business associations can support them, and more can be done. And I would like to advocate in favor of ZenDiS here. I think that this is a reliable contact within administration, because our challenge is that we're entrepreneurs. We're always suspicious of selling something. Even if we want to sell the best solution available, administrations are critical vis-a-vis us, probably rightly so. And so it's good if somebody in the administration has the competence to evaluate what are they telling us here, so that every purchaser in every municipality doesn't have to do that themselves. That's really important. And the other level, and I think that's the one that you were asking about, is the political level. And I believe that we have seen this again and again, that you can change products in administration, but this always goes hand in hand with dissatisfaction, discontent, open source or no open source. It can be Lotus Notes or Microsoft Exchange. The armed services needed 10 years for that.
Lotus Notes always was a good idea.
And, well, the armed forces opted against it, or IBM lost a tender, I don't know, but whatever. What we definitely need is political will. And we can see that again and again as well, that administrations, ministries are willing to act fast and in a targeted way, much more if they know that the political leadership wants that. And that's a good sign, because administrations aren't supposed to just administer. They're supposed to do what democracy, what politicians expect them to do. And That is where I see the problem, really, that in politics and in the federal government in the states, we have that. There's very good people there, but in the federal government, there's someone missing who advocates for this topic.
A point that you mentioned this morning, and I think that this is done regularly, that is that the state has the biggest IT budget, and thus the state could invest significantly. And the question for me is, how can this work or should work? For example, if at ZenDiS not even all heads of states participate, how could it work that as a federation we can do procurement, though I have auto administration at the different land level? How could that work?
Ich kann vielleicht mal anfangen, du kannst gerne ergänzen, Peter. Ich glaube, der Punkt ist der, dass man...
Well, I think the point is this. We need to overcome fears in many areas, and I feel that again and again, that I have to explain the advantages, not here now, but oftentimes at the level of decision makers, but also at the level of just normal administration staff. You have to explain the benefits, cost savings or whatever. So ZenDiS is supposed to take people to a joint level of information to create a flyer, for instance, or a brochure on how can I source open source software. So then the question, what can industry do? I think industry has to explain at all levels that open source is no longer a niche product. There was a study of the EU speaking of the third wave in open source. And I think that it's very important that we have a uniform level of information, a better competence in terms of procurement, i.e. So that we know how can I procure services for open source software. So we have to distinguish between the services and the software. That is something that most people aren't aware of. So we have to make sure that everybody has the same level of information. There's a central institution now, which is an institution by the federal and state governments.
If I'm allowed to add, us on municipal level, I think quite uniformly agree that ZenDiS is a great step, because this addresses the question that Andreas just mentioned. But I believe that we can start with it, but in the long term we have to think further. You asked what can the federation do more, and we have municipal auto administration, and as municipalities we are part of the land, and sometimes it is said that people do not know the municipalities. So our federalism with regard to IT has to be rethought. Federalism might be good, but I think the federal government, the state government, and the municipalities have to address this differently. And this also against the background of open source, because we need an IT infrastructure which would make it far more easy across all levels to collaborate with another. And municipalities, for example, ask themselves if they are land or state borders, why should a group in Bavaria not have something which is interesting for a municipality in Schleswig-Holstein? And that often leads to problems. And in the coalition agreement, this is under the headline of federal dialogue, and I think that this is something that we need to do against this background.
At your two levels, at municipal and state level, is it being discussed, what that might look like going forward?
Well, it always depends on oneself. So for me and my federal state, it is the Federal Online Access Law, where the municipalities, the states, and the federation agreed that under the principle of one for all, product and online performances are made available. And these are now really implemented and can then be used by other federal states. And in our state, as well as in other states, we do not have the legal right of transmission of implemented services. So once the performances are brought to the state level, we cannot pass it on to the municipal level, because this is limited to the state level. And I'm doing a so-called UZG tour. So I visit all the mayors in Saxony-Anhalt to really convince mayors for the topic of digitization. There are still mayors around in Germany who say, I've got a staff of 30 and we're doing very well with paper, and limit ourselves to paper. So there's another obstacle that needs to be overcome. So we are working on a collaboration structure right now to really meet on an equal footing so that the municipalities and the land level are coming together, and then jointly things can be steered in such a way that with regard to digital sovereignty and open source, they can be addressed. Because I've got a very clear idea how the procedural approaches I've seen, there are also providers of educational software, and there we need specific procedures that need to be developed jointly, and we want to collaborate across different levels unless there are any constitutional concerns. And on our state level, we have more funds available than the municipalities, which are in a difficult situation. With regard to the cooperation between states and the federation, the problem is similar. So, well, I don't want to do any federation bashing, but we have to admit that collaboration has to be seen a bit further. And at the ZenDiS, we were asked shareholders to join the federal limited company, and it was a permitted access, whether now or in 5 years or 10 years. And we really refrained a bit, because you have to have the collaboration management, participation management, so finance minister, then it has to go to the government. Why do we have to now fund another institution? And so here collaboration could certainly be improved, and this is true with regard to what we can offer as a land, as competence, but also what is added by the federal state. And I look at you, but I don't mean you personally. I speak of the federal ministry, and we're far away. So there we need to improve our options. And this is independently of digital sovereignty. But the question is, how does the federal state commit itself in digitization projects? And there's the claim of Dresden that the federal government should also provide the expert procedure, and then it would be within the competencies of the federal state, but they say we don't have the competencies, we don't have the people to do it, and then it goes back to the state, and then we have to see that we get the specialist application. So I think that this could be improved, but there are always problems coming up, and we need to improve on this.
Maybe one sentence on the demands from Dresden. There is something written at the municipal level by the German Council of Cities with two requirements. First of all, we say with commissioned work. So if we are tasked by the Federation to do something, then we should have central procurement of IT. It doesn't have to be a big centralized thing. We could imagine a platform with different IT services, which I could then purchase with ease. Ideally open source, of course. And the second thrust would be, which would tie into that, the discussion of what would be the distribution of tasks. Now, we've had the separation of tasks between the states and federal levels, and this has been around for forever, but now we have IT, digitization, and we might have to rethink what would be an optimum separation of tasks between the Federation and the states.
Peter, get ready for questions, and maybe we get some microphones into the room. Peter?
I'd like to get back to the initial question you asked, because I do have the impression that, well, Bernd said, we're getting entangled in the problems we created ourselves again and again. And we're talking about digital sovereignty and control of the foundations of our life. It's not a nice-to-have feature where we can discuss processes and responsibility and what does the state and what does the municipalities do. That we can't discuss that again for another 5 years. That makes me nervous. I'm sorry if I hear that sort of thing. But that's not the kind of speed we need. And there are such simple options. It's not like there's an industry that's capable and willing to deliver. If the government now simply said, let me take the example of a sovereign administrative workplace. I will buy that with so many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands users if the open source industry can deliver this with such and such features. That is, and you don't even have to pay for it, only when it's there. That is exactly what Microsoft are doing now. They build it for free, not because they have too much money to throw around, but because they know that these features will be demanded, and then we will earn major bucks with it. And so the state should actually use its demand power, and we need to organize this. And in tenders, we have to say if there are two similar solutions, and one of them is just a little bit worse, but it's open source, it's still much better for the state.
Okay, but we both agree. Okay, this is what we want. And with the supporter of Dataport, and I don't know whether you will present all this in a moment. Yeah, the colleague will present it, so I won't tell you more about this. But I want to get to a situation where I would like to describe administrative digitization. With regard to the online access law, we develop front-end digital access to citizen services. And then I think, or my imagination is that we have a process platform where the state and public administration can collaborate with citizens. So we have the electronic file, standardized workplace, electronic processing of procedures. All this should happen on the process platform. And there, incrementally and step by step, we can also expand other standardized options outside of Microsoft. And our service providers are working on this. And if you then say this is the coupling point for specialist procedures, then they will immediately go to the market according to state stipulations. And this is what we would like to organize. I cannot say, is there, no, all fine, sorry. There was something. There are people who are crossing the stage and are just making sure everybody's amused. Okay, but we then can really enter as a state, but we cannot say ad hoc, Microsoft, go home. Because if I did this, CIO, all specialist ministries would be against me. And this is what you said. Many employees are very afraid of getting away from Microsoft. They think that they can't rule the world anymore. And the Linux workplace has more functionality and a similar visualization to what the Microsoft solution offers. But there is a cultural change that we will have to drive. But from a state side, we would say front-end process platform, expert procedures, so that we then get to digital sovereignty, and the proprietary providers then have to adapt to this. And we will do this because they can't offer any marketable solutions. But this will take time. It won't be overnight. This is not to be expected.
Yes, it takes its time. Our panel has been taking its time as well, 46 minutes. We have another 4 minutes, so we have time for a question, maybe two if it's a short one. Does anyone have a question to ask? In the center.
That was on purpose. Okay, the microphone is coming and somebody is rushing to get it to you.
Sehr gut. Einmal einander näher kommen. Perfekt.
Okay, so there it is. Perfect. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yeah. Mr. Vaskov, KDO, I've got a comment. I think we could convince more users if the usability and user design were more focused upon. Because once we produce a good application, then it might not be even necessary that we really have to have these difficult procurement procedures. And then the user easily would go from Outlook into Open Exchange. This is what we have to work on, and then you can sell it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that's exactly what needs to be put into those requirements. That's exactly what we need to say, I need this usability so people don't complain about it. And if you deliver this, then I'll procure that. That's the point.
But with regard to requirements, public services can ask or put requirements out and then trying to implement them for decades. So like Phoenix and Co., what is happening? So we've got something, it's good, it's bad, this is missing, so we're working on this. But with regard to the open source, we have to tell them we are able to design and co-design. And there's always this requirement. Maybe I've been working for too long in public service, but you should not make the mistake to at very length have a tender as to what we need. But we do know what we need day in, day out. And this has to be made available, and then we jointly continue to develop the projects. And this is so great, because then we can decide what we want, and we are not steered by third parties. Oh, that's a wonderful concluding remark.
Great word of conclusion there. Thank you very, very much to my panel. And we've heard so much from Felix. We'll continue listening to him. But thanks again to Bernd, Schlömer, Peter Ganten, Annika, Krellmann, and Ann-Kathrin Riedel. Thanks for coming.